Okay, welcome. I'm enormously privileged and very gratified to have James Thornton, CEO of ClientEarth, join us today. James, welcome.
Thank you very much, Paul.
We've had a long engagement with ClientEarth right from the very beginning of the conduit, and I'm an enormous fan of your work. And what I want to do today is focus in on a kind of the geopolitics of climate change in a post-pandemic or current pandemic context, and focus a little bit on both China and the EU as two very important kind of theaters of engagement, as it were. And then maybe, if we, time permitting, have a little bit of a spine into clean air for a bit, given its importance in a post-COVID world. But let's start with China for a moment. And before we went live, you and I were having a conversation about the internal work that you as ClientEarth have been doing within China, but also China's external role in the Belt and Road Initiative in arguably exporting a carbon problem, but potentially ameliorating a carbon problem through the way the Belt and Road works. So can we touch on those two dimensions, at least to kick off, and then we'll pivot to talk about the EU?
Sure. So China is a fascinating place to have been working since 2014 now. I was invited in by the Supreme People's Court, so the Supreme Court of China, to advise them in 2014. They were looking to write a law to allow citizen groups, environmental NGOs, to sue polluting companies for the first time in China. So I engaged with them on that, helped them write that, and then went back a few months later, and they had remarkably taken everything I'd done with them and written it directly into the Chinese law. And then which doesn't happen in Brussels very often or in Washington. And and then the question from the senior Supreme Court judge that I was working with was, what would you like to do now? And I said, well, you've just appointed 3,000 environment court judges. Get that, 3,000 environment court judges. It's quite unlike anywhere else on the planet. There are only a few environment court judges here and there around the world. In Europe, there are only a few in Sweden, as far as I know, and nowhere else. So to appoint 3,000 environment court judges was already a big deal. And I said, okay, well, they need training. And the senior Supreme Court judge said, you couldn't be more right. Would you like to train them? And I thought, wow, amazing opportunity. So I said, sure. And then we started working with the Supreme Court directly, bringing in experts from around the world to train what's now been around 1,000 of these judges in the global best practice in making environmental decisions. And then the prosecutors came to us about a year after that and said, the judges love the training they're getting. Would you help us? In that law you helped write, we got the right to sue the central Chinese government for the first time, and other parts of the government, on behalf of the people. So now we can sue the government on behalf of the people for violations of, say, air quality law in Yunnan province. But we don't know how to sue the government. And you sue the government all over the place, and you always seem to win. Could you help train us? So amazing to be asked by the prosecutors to assist them in figuring out how to sue the Chinese government. So we've been doing that. And since 2018, the prosecutors have initiated over 100,000 cases to clean up the environment in China. Just imagine that. I mean, they're going from a very low baseline of compliance. So terrible environmental compliance, pretty decent laws, bad compliance, no enforcement. But in the last couple of years, over 100,000 cases, which they're winning, and the majority of those have actually been against government institutions to force them to enforce the law. So internally, there's been a real sea change. When I use the word revolution, the Chinese say, that's a big word for us, but it's definitely a sea change, in how they're doing things. So that's great. Now, as many of our listeners will know, they've also got a lot of coal-fired power stations. You were asking about the time of Corona. The concern is that, as in 2008, when there was a downturn, there will be an uptick in building coal-fired power stations. That's a very real problem internally. But the the good news internally is that they're really, really keen on cleaning up pollution. And then you asked about Belt and Road, but please.
Yeah, so let's focus on them, let's stay with internal for a moment. So if you are contributing in a meaningful way to create a kind of legal and judicial infrastructure to help better compliance with existing regulations, where do you think that is? Because that, you know, in some ways that can be the steady, slow, incremental, institution building, rule of law approach to a problem. And if we had all the time in the world, that must clearly be the right way to go. Is it your judgment that that route is occurring with sufficient urgency and the standards are sufficiently stringent to meet the kind of goals that we need? Or are we going to have to kind of supplement some step change improvements on top of that?
Well, I think step change improvements on top of that are required in Europe and everywhere else, you know, so also in China. But those are only meaningful if you also have a rule of law for the environment. So if you have regulations which are meaningful regulations, which the Chinese in fact have, and then enforce them, and on top of that, you can go the next step. And they weren't doing that. So in Europe, compliance, pretty good. In the United States, environmental compliance, pretty good. In China, it wasn't. But, and indeed, 10 years ago, you couldn't talk about the rule of law. I mean, you got in trouble for talking about the rule of law. Now, as of about 5 years ago, the Politburo, in one of their 5-year plans, said building the rule of law is one of our prime directives. We're going to build the rule of law. So there'll be a testable legal basis for everything, not alone the environment, but in the environment for sure. I mean, the idea of initiating over 100,000 environmental enforcement cases in just a couple of years is way off the charts compared to anything that ever happened in Europe or the United States when they were beginning that building of the rule of law. So the way they're attacking this is really fierce. Yeah.
And on the coal-fired power plants, because obviously any pathway to net zero and any pathway to sticking at 1.5 degrees requires a very aggressive tackling, I mean, a prevention of the building of new coal-fired power plants, but also a decommissioning at a rapid rate of existing ones. And China is obviously central to that. So in a COVID world, in a post-COVID world, you said that that's a risk. Does ClientEarth have a strategy to try and both limit and shut down coal-fired power plants in China? And how confident do you feel that you might succeed in that endeavor?
Well, our goal is to prevent them from being built and shut down existing ones around the world. I mean, we've been doing that in Europe very successfully for the last 13, 14 years. There haven't been any built since we started our campaign against them, and we've started shutting them down. And we're just switching to Asia. I mean, there are something like, it's not just China, but there are something like 425 coal plants that are looking to be built all over Asia. And the ones ex-China are again previewed to be funded both by Chinese entities, Chinese banks, but also by other banks, so Japanese banks, Korean banks, European banks. So we're initiating a large program to try and prevent, working with local communities, try and prevent those ex-China coal-fired power stations from being built as part of our global project to try and prevent coal. And then we also always work on energy policy to make sure that the inducements, the financial inducements in the market are to build renewable energy. Renewable energy, I mean, if you have any brains these days, you want to build renewable energy because most places in the world, it's not only cleaner, but cheaper and certainly better in the long run, but not everywhere. And you need to play with the energy markets to make sure that they encourage that. Now, inside China, what you can do is talk to the government about what the best policies are. And we've had some very high-level seminars on the financing of coal versus the financing of renewable energy to try and encourage the right thinking. But China, like everywhere else, is a place where there are conflicting views. In Washington, there are conflicting views, and in London and in Brussels. And there are those that are arguing for the building of more coal, and there are those arguing for the building of more clean. But certainly their long-term ambition is to get away from coal and begin shutting the coal-fired power stations down. And they've been building on an annual basis more renewable energy than the rest of the world combined for the last few years. So, but it's not a done deal.
So let's now talk about the Belt and Road, and again, it obviously touches on coal-fired power plants ex-China to the extent that they get financed or supported as part of Belt and Road. But then there's obviously the Belt and Road in general, and you've done some really interesting work in seeking to green the Belt and Road initiative. So tell us about that.
Well, for the Belt and Road, just a second on the Belt and Road, it is the world's largest infrastructure set of projects at present, and the price tag will be well over $1 trillion, perhaps several times that. And the idea is that China wants to connect something like 100 countries more closely with China for trade purposes mostly. So they want to build infrastructure of power and of transport mostly. And if you think about it, if you do that in the right way, and if it was really done in an entirely green way, you'd be moving the world towards the Paris Agreement targets. Because where else do you get $1 trillion in infrastructure projects? Actually, in Europe, we'll get to that, I hope. But in the Belt and Road, you have this astounding ability to build green infrastructure, or the opposite, to build brown infrastructure. And the interesting thing about the Belt and Road is that it's a very loose concept rather than, there's no Belt and Road ministry. It's an agglomeration of projects. So there was no central eye looking over the Belt and Road projects in all of these countries to say, is this green or is this brown? And we and many others began to argue some years ago that this would be a fantastic thing if somebody actually looked at all of these projects. And the Ministry of Environment has now stepped up, and it has a very, very strong program going on to green the Belt and Road, which we and all of our friends are helping in. And it's a really simple idea, and it's a brilliant one. And they call it the green light system, the traffic light system. And the idea is to have a view of all projected development. So roads, power plants, canals, ports. And the view is with respect to how green are they or how brown are they. So a red light would go for a coal-fired power station. A solar plant in, say, Indonesia would get a green light, and something else might be in between. And they're looking at biodiversity as well as climate. So, and they're doing it in this very thorough Chinese way. They have something like 10 committees, and I serve on one of them, looking at this, bringing in global experts. Our mutual friend Eric Solsheim is in a leading position here, and he used to run the United Nations Environment Program. He's a global expert on this stuff. And again, their seriousness is showed by bringing in a global expert like Eric to be the foreign expert advising on how to make this work in all of these countries. So it's very sophisticated. And then one of the questions is, how do you do dispute resolution? Among, say, a plant is going in Pakistan, which is one of the early countries for a lot of investment. And the people there think that it doesn't comply with appropriate standards. And we've been raising the question of how do you have this inter-country dispute resolution mechanism for Belt and Road countries for a while. And the Supreme Court held of China held a very interesting conference on that late last year. So as the Belt and Road really gets underway, the hope is that there will be both this green lighting mechanism, so funding will be preferentially directed towards environmentally benign or positive projects, but then there will also be a dispute resolution mechanism, so you build an international rule of law around this as well.
I've always understood the Belt and Road as being part of an effort of China to assert its geopolitical influence and part of a way of sort of asserting a new hegemony and a new world order. And when that, in experience, when a green imperative comes into contact with, I'm going to build your port, and if I can do so, I can be at the heart of your country's economy, and therefore I can place Chinese interests at the heart of our economic and political relationships. And somebody says, well, no, you need to build that port in a more green way. And there's another person in the ministry who says, well, that's going to be more complicated and cost more and not serve our short-term interests. My instinct is that I know where I think who wins in that debate, but is it more complicated than that? And do you actually see moments where sustainable credentials trump geopolitics as these two things intersect?
You've asked a very important question, and it's a good anticipatory question, and we don't have the answer yet. I mean, the Belt and Road projects that have been completed were before this new view of what's a green project or a brown project. So as projects now, I hope, come through this pipeline, we'll begin to be able to answer that question. You know, in the West, when it's generally simply a matter of economics, then certainly the dynamics you're talking about do get played out. Here, we need to see whether there will be a willingness on the part of Chinese banks or others, say Japanese banks who are financing some of these things, to say this is a better long-term investment. Now, what is in the favor of global people and the global environment in this regard is that the economics have moved in favor of, certainly with respect to energy projects, of green energy. You know, and one of the interesting pieces of data on that the folks that we're speaking with today might be interested in is the Oxford Smith School did a terrific study, came out just a couple of weeks ago, on green stimulus. And the question they started with was, there's been a big stimulus about jobs already. The next wave could either be, like the Belt and Road, could either be green stimulus or old-fashioned brown stimulus, just handing money to car companies and airlines and so on. So what's better economically? And they did this fascinating study where they went to, in the end, they got responses from 230 economists globally. And these weren't necessarily progressive people. They were working in central banks and ministries around the world. And they wanted to see what sort of stimulus is best for the economy, what kind gives the most rapid payback, the largest multiplier in terms of benefit, and then are they green or brown? And you know, I held my breath hoping that the projects that we would like to see as environmentalists came out ahead, and they did. So these 230 economists around the world, not known for being progressive, you know, when you ranked along those three scales, what came out way ahead in terms of what they thought stimulus money should go to was green infrastructure, green energy infrastructure, you know, charging infrastructure for you know, for cars, good power lines, R&D, and also education. So the economics, that's just one example of economists around the world now understand that the economics are in favor of the right decisions being made. But you need to set the system up, like with the traffic light system, so somebody has a look at it. Otherwise, the inertia of the old way of doing things would still get brown projects built.
So now let's pivot to discussion about the EU and both the kind of EU-wide New Green Deal, as it were, but also both at a country level, but at a kind of EU level, moving towards orienting the building back and the stimulus and the rescue efforts in response to Corona, having a kind of sustainable and green filter. Give us just the lay of the land, how optimistic you feel about the current state of play.
Well, remarkably, I mean, I was talking to the former Environment Commissioner, Potocnik, a couple of weeks ago, and his view is an interesting one. He said, I think that the Green Deal is a miracle. You know, in political terms, I reflected on that, and I'm not sure that he's not right. You know, it was astounding that this commission came in saying what we are going to do is a Green Deal, and that they've held to it through the coronavirus. And they really have. I mean, Timmermans, the vice president of the commission, was saying the same things a few days ago that he was in January. Angela Merkel, just 2 weeks ago or so, said that she was comfortable increasing the CO2 reduction for the EU to 45% by 2030. So there's something very real going on. And it's enormously encouraging. As with everything at the EU, you know, it's a very beautiful set of concepts. And what will now be really critical is the detail and the way that it's actually made real. And that's always the case. I mean, it's always the case everywhere, I guess, but it is particularly the case in Europe. So we're working on that, and a lot of our environmental friends will be working on that, and to encourage the Commission to keep doing the right thing, because there will be a lot of voices on the other side.
So I guess there are two parts of this. One is increasingly stringent standards and goals. And there, I think ClientEarth plays a particularly crucial role, because the more stringent the standards become, the more robust your advocacy and your litigation strategies can be. And then the second dimension is obviously the economic stimulus to help give people pathways to be able to afford the alternatives when the non-compliant forms of economic activity are either limited or struck down through litigation. Where are you seeing your most fruitful sources of intervention and litigation in the European context right now?
Well, I mean, before we get to litigation, which is always a wonderful story, about half of what we do is actually setting the rules. So is actually designing the laws with anyone who will work with us. You know, environmental groups, people in the Commission, people in member states, governments, and so on. And you know, as the Green Deal gets particularized, where the money goes is enormously important. And so we're involved in those discussions in Brussels. And one of our most senior lawyers will be working full time on that, you know, to encourage the Commission to keep doing the right things in detail. I mean, one of the other things in that regard that we're working on very strong way is the Common Agricultural Policy. Because the Common Agricultural Policy is around 60 billion euros a year in subsidies, and those have been basically entirely brown, you know, since the beginning of the CAP. And if you switch that, then you've got a recurring large subsidy to do green things. And the CAP is open for negotiation now, and we now have, again, one of our most senior lawyers working on that full time with a team of lawyers. That the CAP had not been aligned with the Green Deal. It was just going its own way. And we and others have now convinced the Commission to align the CAP with the Green Deal, which, if it stays there, which I think it will, would again be a very powerful continuing subsidy.
I want to ask two kind of more detailed questions about CAP. One is, I wonder whether you think that there is an opportunity to tackle industrial factory farming, particularly in meat production, and the subsidization or support thereof, or the absence of regulation pertaining to it, and particularly a kind of subsection, which is one of my kind of bugbears, which is the free-fall use of antibiotics in otherwise healthy animals, contributing to the potential spread of drug-resistant superbugs. And you know, this, if one were to think about risk registers right now, drug-resistant superbugs being the other shoe of that drops in relation to pandemics, must be something that the public will be very concerned and attentive to, and be in our food system. So. Is there an opportunity now in pandemic world to take a look at kind of health in relation to food systems and try to push for more systemic change through that particular prism?
Well, I think so. And again, this is something we're working on. So in the CAP negotiations, what the EU has already said is it's as part of making a systemically greener agriculture, they want to reduce chemical use. And what they were thinking of is pesticides, herbicides, and that sort of thing. But antibiotics, I think, now become part of the discussion in a way that should become meaningful. Absolutely, the industrial farming will be addressed here in the CAP, and a reduction of subsidies is on the table from our perspective. But their litigation also comes in, because the potential for litigation is very real against the factory farms and against the countries that have the big factory farms. Pig farms, for example, in France and Germany is one good example, huge industrial pig farms, because those countries are not enforcing existing laws. It's about like China. I mean, they're not enforcing the laws against these on pollution and on animal welfare. So these enormous factory farms get away with it, and that's an area I would very much like to litigate in conjunction with changing the CAP requirements.
So, and how else might the greening of CAP happen other than through kind of factory farming? Are there other strategies that you're focusing on that people would be interested to hear about?
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, basically all parts of the CAP can be green. So what you need to do is to set, the way the CAP works is it's like everything at the EU. You have these EU rules, which then member states implement. So what we're arguing for are measurable standards at the EU level, so the states can't wander off and do whatever they want, which is what happens now. And they get captured by the agro-industrial lobby in France and Germany and so on. So we're arguing for standards at the EU level on use of chemicals is a big one, and then also on the non-tillage. So you get a much more resilient agriculture if you don't till as much. That's one. The farm to fork strategy was just announced, the EU's farm to fork strategy the other day, which it looks pretty good. Which is a way of trying to guarantee clean food and produce resilient agriculture at the same time. So really all aspects of agriculture are open for under the CAP negotiation, and they all need attending to. The exciting thing is that this only happens once every 10 years. And there's so much money behind it that if the rules can be changed at EU level, not just member states allowed to do whatever they want and captured there by the agro-industrial interests, then there'll be an enforceable set of standards, which all environmental groups can then go to the member states and say to France, say to Germany, say to Italy, say, it used to be the UK, that you're not complying with these standards, and then actually be able to do something about it in court. None of that has been in place before. So the rule of law for doing good things for the in agricultural domain didn't exist, and that's what we can get going now. It's very, very encouraging. And the Commission, as with the Green Deal, really sees the opportunity and the need. So here's you have both in China and the EU, interestingly, it's those two who are the big blocks of governmental power in the world right now that are both trying to do something positive for the environment.
So let me ask that. I mean, we spoke about internal China compliance, greening the Belt and Road. You've spoken about the EU's own standards, its green stimulus, and then recurring revenue streams like CAP, which could be greened, which would be very incrementally powerful. I wonder if there's another way that the EU can exert its standard setting in an extraterritorial way. That is by thinking about these kind of cross-border pollution tariffs that have at least been conceptually introduced to, say, countries which are not complying but which trade with the EU, may be subject to tariffs. How far away is that? Is that just a kind of notional concept, or do you think that that actually might be another way of the EU exerting influence beyond its borders?
I think that's a very powerful way in which it can do it. And I think the idea of cross-border carbon taxes is actually quite live in Brussels, which would be a very powerful way to do this. The EU has put in a good law on timber so the timber exporting countries will only be able to send, and we work heavily on this in Africa, in 5 African countries, can only send legally harvested timber to the EU. So that's another very good example of the EU putting up a set of regulations that creates a domain in which the vast EU market will encourage compliance with law. There are other things, that we're fighting to make the EU do, which it should do. For example, now pesticides that are banned and herbicides banned for use in the EU because the EU thinks they're too dangerous for humans and the environment are still allowed to be exported. That's madness. That has to change. So that there are big things like that the EU still needs to do.
2 questions. We're getting towards the end of our time, but 2 questions from some of our viewers. One is your view on the UK lowering its standards post leaving the EU. And then second, a more specific question on on-farm carbon sequestration targets in a greener cap. Your views on both of those.
Yeah. Well, starting with the second one first, the carbon sequestration is one of the great opportunities of this cap. So that, there are a variety of ways to farm that allow the soil to recover its health, its own biodiversity of microorganisms, and therefore sequester carbon. That's one of the examples when I was talking about setting European standards. That's one of the standards you want to set. So for the health of soil and a set of such standards for the health of soil. And we're talking about people globally on that. You would also, one of the benefits to farmers could be being paid to sequester carbon. And that would be terrific, because farmers need subsidies. At the moment, though, the subsidies are making them have to do all the wrong things. So the cap can become, instead of 60 billion in bad subsidies, it can be 60 billion a year in investment in sustainable farming and carbon sequestration and so on. On the UK, I genuinely hope that the government's claim that it will not lower its standards for the environment is more robust than its claims on many other things. And we'll have to wait and see. It does say that it's going to continue to match the EU carbon reduction targets, and Boris Johnson said that a few weeks ago in a speech. I hope it's true. The UK still has, with respect to carbon, its own Climate Change Act, which is a very good law. And if it continues to follow that, then it will be a good climate actor. Michael Gove has consistently said that he wants the farming in the UK to become better than farming in Europe. There is the possibility of actually making the UK a fantastic laboratory for agriculture and zooming ahead over the cap, so that it becomes the laboratory that shows what could be done in the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. I'm hopeful. What we all know is that governments say very enticing things, and then it sometimes doesn't happen.
2 quick, maybe final questions. One, a question about methane, again raised. Obviously, exponentially larger impacts and damage inflicted by methane. So do you have a kind of overall view and strategy on methane and what what standards or regulations do you think could be brought in? Obviously, meat-free protein would be a massive contributor to it. And then a sort of subsection is the sort of the disposal of CFCs in particular. I think, all the work on drawdown says if we don't safely dispose of CFCs, in fact, all the other drawdown work that we're doing may be for naught. And that seems to me to be a very particular, very technical problem where you get incredible bang for the buck out of just attending to it in a disciplined and thoughtful way. So thoughts on those two would be appreciated.
Yeah, well, on CFCs, I mean, an interesting point there is that the Montreal Protocol on CFCs, which is the beginning regulation, is actually one of the best global environmental regulations. So it has worked up to a point, and much more needs to be done. And that's not something I'm working on at the moment. It's something we're looking at. Methane is touched on by a lot of the work we do. So when trying to reduce factory farming, one of the big sources of methane emissions, in our energy work and trying to reduce so-called fugitive methane, which is the methane that escapes from natural gas pipelines and natural gas exploration. Because natural gas, in theory, is 50% better than coal as a fossil fuel, still not great. But if a lot of the methane escapes, then in the process of either drilling or transport, it can be worse than coal. So one of the things we've been looking at is moving beyond our shutting down of coal to shutting down of all uses of fossil fuels, over time. So, and in discouraging the investment in greenfield gas. So we were among those who convinced the European Investment Bank not to invest in greenfield gas sites.
I guess I have a very final question.
Okay.
I wonder whether you were involved in this one at all, but Murat asked a question. There's been a case in Germany where a Peruvian farmer sued energy giant RWE for being responsible for global warming, destroying his livelihood. Do you see this as a precedent setting, or is there something useful that can be done in that regard?
Yes, RWE is one of the bad actors, and we're involved in various ways of hitting RWE. It's a very interesting case, and I of course, we have a Berlin office, and I of course know the lawyer who's working on that. That's not one of our cases, but it's a terrific example of a creative use of a theory of trying to connect up the world and connect up harms with the people who cause the harms. And we'll see where that goes. One can only see how these experiments work, but it's one of many really interesting experiments in the realm of global climate litigation.
James Thornton, thank you so very much for joining this session. I must say, on a personal note, every time I speak to somebody from ClientEarth, it reminds me of my days in the trenches in the anti-apartheid movement, a group of very smart lawyers engaging thoughtfully both in standard setting and in precedent setting litigation. And I think you are today's anti-apartheid movement tackling as bad a scourge as apartheid was, which is the climate emergency. So I'm enormously grateful for all your work, and I think we in the Conduit will continue to watch it and support it in any way we can. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's a great pleasure, and thank you for your kind words.
Great. All right, everybody, stay safe and stay well. See you tomorrow.
Cheers. Bye-bye.